Rises picture this. It's 1853, and the peaceful waters of Tokyo Bay are shattered by the thunderous cannons of American warships. Commodore Matthew Perry's black ships loom menacingly against the horizon, their steam engines smoking like dragons breathing industrial fire. For over 2 centuries, Japan had lived in splendid isolation, a nation of cherry blossoms and samurai warriors, blissfully unaware of the Industrial Revolution reshaping the world beyond its shores. But in those ships lay more than just American naval power. They carried the weight of a new era crashing against the ancient shores of feudal Japan. What happened next would transform a nation of rice farmers and sword-wielding aristocrats into one of the most formidable military powers the world had ever seen, ultimately setting the stage for a conflict that would reshape the entire globe. This is the story of how Japan shed its feudal skin and emerged as an imperial warrior, the tale of samurai becoming soldiers, of a nation choosing expansion over isolation, and of democracy giving way to military dictatorship. It's a story of ambition, transformation, and ultimately, a descent into darkness that began not with WWII, but with the dawn of the Meiji Restoration in 1868. Chapter 1. The Death of Feudalism. To understand the origins of Japanese militarism, we must first understand what was dying. The ancient Tokugawa shogunate that had ruled Japan for 250 years of relative peace and prosperity. Picture Japan as it was in 1868, a society rigidly structured like a complex chessboard, where everyone knew their place from the emperor on his throne to the farmers in their paddies. The Tokugawa system was a masterpiece of social engineering. Under this feudal arrangement, society was divided into 4 classes: samurai, artisans, farmers, and merchants, each with clearly defined roles and responsibilities. The samurai, Japan's warrior class, formed the ruling elite, governing vast estates and maintaining the Pax Tokugawa that had brought peace to the islands for centuries. But peace, as it often does, had bred complacency. By the mid-19th century, many samurai had become bureaucrats or traders, their warrior skills rusting from disuse, while their swords became ceremonial symbols rather than tools of war. The merchant class, officially ranked lowest but holding real economic power, grew increasingly frustrated with their social restrictions. The peasantry, representing 80% of the population, toiled in endless cycles of rice cultivation while watching their samurai overlords live off their labor. Then came Perry's ships, and everything changed. The arrival of the American fleet exposed Japan's military weakness with devastating clarity. While the United States had steam-powered warships armed with modern cannons, Japan still relied on samurai wielding swords and archers drawing bows. The unequal treaties that followed, like the Treaty of Kanagawa, forced Japan to open its ports to foreign trade and allow extraterritorial rights to Westerners. For a nation that had controlled its own destiny for centuries, this was a humiliation that sparked a revolution. Enter the rebels, the Choshu and Satsuma clans, 2 powerful domains that had grown increasingly frustrated with the Tokugawa shogunate's inability to resist foreign pressure. These weren't mere political dissidents. They were a new breed of leader who understood that Japan's survival required fundamental change. On January 3, 1868, these forces toppled the shogunate and declared the restoration of imperial rule under Emperor Meiji. What followed was one of history's most remarkable transformations. In the span of just 1 generation, Japan would leap from medieval feudalism to modern industrial power. But this transformation came with a crucial catch. It would be driven from its very foundation by military necessity. Chapter 2. The Samurai's Last Stand. The new Meiji government faced an existential question. How do you modernize a nation when surrounded by colonial powers who showed no mercy to the weak? Their answer would reshape Japan forever. The transformation began with the most symbolic class in Japanese society, the samurai. In 1872, the government did something unprecedented. It created a national army based on universal conscription. No longer would military service be the exclusive right of the warrior class. Every Japanese man, from farmers' sons to merchants' boys, would now serve 3 years in the military regardless of their social background. This wasn't just military reform, it was social revolution. The government declared all classes equal, abolished the feudal domains that had sustained the samurai for centuries and offered the warrior class a choice: accept government bonds in place of their traditional stipends, or find new occupations. Many samurai cut their top knots in favor of Western-style haircuts and donned business suits instead of armor. Others, however, couldn't accept this brave new world. In 1877, the last great samurai rebellion erupted in Satsuma. Led by General Saigo Takamori, thousands of traditional warriors took up arms against the modernization they saw as destroying the soul of Japan. What followed was a battle that symbolized the end of an era. These samurai, brave as they were, faced an army of conscripts trained in European infantry tactics and armed with modern Western rifles. The result was devastating. The modernized Japanese army, using machine guns and artillery, crushed the traditional samurai forces decisively. Saigo Takamori died in battle, and with him died the age of the samurai. But in killing the samurai, Japan created something new and dangerous: a military class unbound by the ancient codes that had once constrained their predecessors. Modern military training emphasized not just individual honor, but national glory and expansion. The Bushido code, traditionally about personal honor and duty to one's lord, was being redefined to serve a new master, the nation-state itself. By 1876, the government banned the wearing of samurai swords altogether. The last physical symbol of the warrior class had fallen, but the spirit of martial excellence that had defined the samurai lived on, now redirected toward building what would become one of the most formidable military machines in the world. Chapter 3. The Art of War. Japanese style with the samurai class transformed and a modern army established, Japan began its military education in earnest. The government sent military observers to Europe and America, studying the latest military tactics and technologies. They recruited Prussian officers to train their army and British naval experts to build their fleet. The results were staggering. Within decades, Japan had built industrial facilities capable of manufacturing modern weapons. The Yawata Iron and Steel Works, established with indemnities from China's defeat in 1894, was just one example of how military success fed industrial development. But Japan's military modernization wasn't just about copying Western methods. It was about fusing ancient warrior traditions with modern technology. The concept of Bushido, the samurai way of the warrior, was systematically codified and adapted for a modern military context. This new Bushido emphasized loyalty to the emperor, willingness to die for the nation, and the superiority of Japanese spirit over foreign technology. This fusion created a military culture unlike any other in the world. Japanese soldiers were expected to fight not just with skill and courage, but with an almost religious fervor for their emperor and nation. The concept of surrender, foreign to many Western military traditions, became practically non-existent in Japanese forces. By 1894, this new military was ready for its first real test: war with China over control of Korea. The Qing dynasty's forces, still using outdated tactics and equipment, were no match for Japan's modern army and navy. In a conflict that lasted less than a year, Japan crushed Chinese forces in battles on land and sea, securing Taiwan as its first colony and establishing itself as the dominant power in Korea. The victory was intoxicating. For the first time in modern history, an Asian nation had defeated a European-style army using European military methods. This success convinced Japan's leaders that expansion wasn't just possible, it was essential for national survival. But the real test was yet to come: war with a major European power. Chapter 4. The Great Gambit in 1904. Japan's imperial ambitions collided with Russian expansionism in Korea and Manchuria. The Russian Empire, spanning 11 time zones and holding vast armies in Europe, seemed an invincible opponent. Few observers gave Japan much chance of success, but Japan had learned well from its military modernization. The Russo-Japanese War became the first time in modern history that an Asian nation defeated a European power in a major conflict. Japan's navy, trained by British advisors and equipped with the latest ships, launched a surprise attack on the Russian fleet at Port Arthur in February 1904. The Battle of Tsushima in May 1905 became the decisive moment. Admiral Heihachiro Togo's fleet, outnumbered but superior in training and tactics, destroyed the Russian Baltic fleet in a single day of combat. It was a victory that shocked the world, not just because Japan had won, but because of how completely they had won. The Treaty of Portsmouth that followed gave Japan a free hand in Korea. Within a year, Ito Hirobumi, Japan's resident general in Korea, had forced a protectorate treaty on the Korean government, reducing the ancient kingdom to a puppet state. When Korean resistance led to Ito's assassination in 1909, Japan responded with annexation in 1910. Korea, one of the world's oldest continuous civilizations, was now part of the Japanese Empire. The Korean royal family was exiled, the Korean language was banned in schools, and Korean cultural traditions were systematically suppressed. This wasn't just conquest, it was cultural genocide disguised as imperial expansion. The Russo-Japanese War had proven something crucial to Japan's leaders. Modern military power could overcome any obstacle, regardless of the opponent's size or reputation. Victory bred confidence, and confidence bred ambition. By 1912, when Emperor Meiji died, Japan had become the strongest imperialist power in East Asia and had achieved equality with the Western powers. The transformation was complete. From isolation to empire, from feudal to modern, from subject to ruler. But Japan's imperial ambitions were just beginning to take shape. Chapter 5. The Great War Opportunity. When World War I erupted in 1914, Japan saw an opportunity that couldn't be missed. Fighting alongside the Allies, Japan launched attacks on German colonial possessions in the Pacific and China. German islands in Micronesia fell to Japanese forces, while Japanese troops seized the German concession in the Chinese port of Tsingtao. The war effort was highly profitable for Japan. With European powers focused on their own continental struggles, Japanese industry experienced a boom. Japanese ships began competing with European vessels in Asian markets, and Japanese banks expanded their influence throughout the region. But Japan's leaders weren't content with simply profiting from the war. They wanted to secure permanent advantages. In 1915, Japan issued the 21 demands to China, seeking extensive concessions including extended leases in Manchuria, joint control of coal and iron resources, and political influence in Chinese cities. These demands revealed Japan's true imperial vision. Not just territorial acquisition, but economic and political dominance over East Asia. The demands created what would become a lasting legacy of ill feeling and distrust between Japan and China. At the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, Japan was recognized as one of the Big Five Allied powers. Japan's leaders had achieved something their predecessors could never have imagined. Their nation now sat at the table with the great powers of Europe and America, helping to redraw the map of the world. But this success also sowed the seeds of future conflict. Japan's territorial gains from World War I, particularly in the Pacific and China, brought it into direct competition with American and British interests. The Washington Conference of 1921-1922 was specifically designed to limit Japanese expansion in the Pacific. The naval limitation treaties that resulted from this conference capped Japan's navy at a 5-3 ratio, compared to Britain and America. To Japanese leaders, this felt like discrimination. They had won their place at the table through military victory, only to be told they couldn't build the fleet necessary to maintain it. The 1920s saw a temporary retreat from aggressive expansionism. Japan withdrew from Shantung province, ended its military intervention in Siberia, and even signed a treaty recognizing the Soviet Union in 1925. This period, known as Taisho democracy after Emperor Taisho, saw parliamentary government grow stronger and civilian politicians assert more control over national policy. But this democratic interlude would prove short-lived, and the forces of militarism were already gathering strength for their comeback. Chapter 6. Democracy's Achilles' heel. The 1920s in Japan were a time of paradox. On one hand, democratic institutions seemed stronger than ever. Political parties like the Minsito and Seiyukai controlled the Diet, and premierships generally reflected the strength of different political factions. On the other hand, the foundations of this democracy were surprisingly fragile. The Universal Manhood Suffrage Law of 1925, which quadrupled the number of eligible voters, seemed like a triumph of democracy. But it also created new problems. Election campaigns became enormously expensive, forcing politicians to rely heavily on the zaibats, the powerful industrial and financial conglomerates that dominated Japan's economy. This dependence on big money created a culture of corruption that weakened public trust in democratic institutions. High-profile scandals involving politicians colluding with government officials became increasingly common, generating widespread dissatisfaction among the public. The military, meanwhile, watched these developments with growing concern and contempt. Under the Meiji Constitution, the Army and Navy ministers were appointed by their respective services, not by the Prime Minister. This meant that military officers could resign from cabinet positions to bring down governments they disagreed with, a nuclear option that civilian politicians couldn't match. The military's constitutional independence was just the beginning. In 1912, a law had been passed restricting eligibility for Army and Navy minister positions to active duty generals and admirals. This seemingly minor provision gave the military an enormous political weapon. If the Army or Navy refused to appoint a successor, the government would collapse. This happened in 1912 when Prime Minister Uehara Yusaku resigned and the Army refused to appoint a successor, causing the government's fall. Military leaders quickly realized they could influence national policy by threatening to resign from cabinet positions. The global economic crisis that began with the 1929 stock market crash proved to be the death blow for Japanese democracy. When the American silk market collapsed in 1929, Japan's economy, dependent on silk exports to America, was devastated. Unemployment soared, rural areas faced famine, and the public lost faith in the politicians who had promised prosperity. The military began exploiting this crisis, arguing that civilian politicians were too corrupt and indecisive to lead the nation through difficult times. They painted themselves as the only force capable of restoring Japan's greatness through decisive action and unwavering commitment to national interests. Chapter 7. The Assassination Round. The end of Japanese democracy didn't come through constitutional crisis or military coup. It came through a series of assassinations that shocked the nation and demonstrated the growing power of radical military factions. The first major assassination occurred in 1930 when Prime Minister Hamaguchi was shot by a right-wing extremist. While he survived initially, the assassination wounded him so severely that he was forced to resign and eventually died from his wounds. But it was the May 15th incident of 1932 that truly marked the beginning of the end for democratic government in Japan. On that day, young Navy officers, inspired by radical nationalist ideologies, stormed the Prime Minister's residence and assassinated Inukai Tsuyoshi. Inukai's murder sent shockwaves through Japanese society. It was the first time in modern Japanese history that a sitting prime minister had been assassinated. The assassins weren't trying to seize power for themselves. Instead, they were radicals who believed that civilian politicians had sold out Japan's interests to foreign powers and that only military leaders could restore the nation's honor. They even demanded their own execution, viewing their actions as a noble sacrifice for their country. What happened next was more chilling than the assassination itself. The military, rather than condemning the assassins, began using their actions to justify their own increasing political intervention. The message was clear. Any politician who opposed military priorities might face similar consequences. Following Inukai's assassination, all subsequent prime ministers were either from the military or possessed militaristic credentials. Democratic political parties, already weakened by corruption scandals and economic crisis, found themselves increasingly marginalized by the growing power of military leaders. The February 26th incident of 1936 represented the final stage of this radicalization. A group of army officers launched a coup attempt, occupying central Tokyo and assassinating several high-ranking officials. While the coup failed, it demonstrated how far radical elements within the military were willing to go to achieve their goals. Even after the failed coup, the military continued to consolidate its power. By 1937, military leaders controlled all major government positions, and Japan's foreign policy became increasingly aggressive and expansionist. Chapter 8. The final transformation. As the 1930s progressed, Japan's military culture had undergone a profound transformation. The ideals of Bushido, once a code governing individual honor and behavior, had been weaponized to serve nationalist ideology. Military service was no longer just a duty, it was the highest expression of Japanese patriotism. This new military culture emphasized several key principles that would define Japanese expansionism in the coming decades. First, the concept of Japanese racial and cultural superiority. Military leaders promoted the idea that Japanese people were uniquely qualified to lead Asia, creating a racial hierarchy that justified imperial expansion. Second, the belief that military solutions were superior to diplomatic ones. This came from Japan's successful use of force to achieve its goals in the Sino-Japanese War, the Russo-Japanese War, and World War I. Third, the worship of the emperor as a divine figure whose will must be carried out without question. Military leaders positioned themselves as the ultimate interpreters of imperial will, creating a system where military decisions became equivalent to divine command. Finally, the rejection of individual rights in favor of collective national interests. This philosophy held that personal sacrifices, including life itself, were not just acceptable, but necessary for the glory of the Japanese Empire. By the late 1930s, these ideas had permeated Japanese society at every level. Military education was mandatory in schools, and young people were indoctrinated with nationalist ideology from childhood. The Imperial Rule Assistance Association, formed in 1940, effectively eliminated all political opposition by merging all remaining parties into a single organization supporting the military regime. The final transformation was complete. Japan had evolved from a feudal society to an imperial power to a military dictatorship, all within the span of a single century. Chapter 9. The Road to Pearl Harbor. The militarization of Japanese society in the 1930s wasn't just about political control, it was about preparing for the next phase of expansion. The military's control over government meant that international relations were increasingly shaped by military thinking rather than diplomatic considerations. Japan's aggression in Manchuria during the early 1930s represented a new phase in imperial expansion. Rather than simply annexing territory, Japan began creating puppet states that could serve as buffers and sources of resources while providing justification for continued military presence. The Mukden Incident of 1931, in which Japanese officers staged an explosion on a railway and blamed it on Chinese saboteurs, provided the pretext for military invasion of Manchuria. Within months, Japan had occupied the entire region and established the puppet state of Manchukuo. But Manchuria was just the beginning. Military leaders began viewing all of East Asia as Japan's rightful sphere of influence. The invasion of China in 1937 marked the point of no return. What began as a limited military operation expanded into a full-scale war that would ultimately involve all of Asia and much of the Pacific. The military's success in these early campaigns reinforced their belief in the superiority of Japanese military power. When European powers fell to Nazi Germany in 1940, Japanese military leaders saw an opportunity to expand their own empire. While the Western democracies were distracted by European conflicts, the tripartite pact with Germany and Italy in 1940 represented Japan's final abandonment of international cooperation in favor of military alliance with other aggressive powers. By this point, democratic institutions had been completely eliminated, political opposition had been silenced, and military leaders controlled every aspect of Japanese government. The attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941 wasn't the beginning of Japan's militarism, it was the culmination of a transformation that had been building for over 70 years. Conclusion: the legacy of transformation is, we stand at the threshold of understanding how a nation of cherry blossoms and haiku became a continent-spanning military machine. We must recognize that this transformation wasn't inevitable. It was the result of specific choices made by specific leaders at specific moments in history. The Meiji Restoration began as an attempt to preserve Japanese independence in the face of Western pressure. But the methods chosen, rapid military modernization, territorial expansion, and the systematic elimination of democratic institutions, created a political culture that prioritized military solutions over diplomatic ones. The samurai code of Bushido, when stripped of its original meaning and refitted for modern nationalism, became a tool for creating soldiers who would rather die than surrender. The defeat of traditional samurai forces in the Satsuma Rebellion created a new military culture unbound by the constraints of ancient honor codes. Japan's early military successes, from the Sino-Japanese War to the Russo-Japanese War, rewarded aggressive policies and convinced leaders that military power was the key to international respect and national survival. Each victory bred overconfidence, and each overconfidence led to greater risks. The decline of democratic institutions in the 1920s and 1930s wasn't caused by military pressure alone. It was enabled by civilian corruption, economic crisis, and the growing belief among Japanese citizens that only the military could restore national pride and economic prosperity. By the time Japanese planes bombed Pearl Harbor, the transformation was complete. The nation that had once viewed itself as a peaceful island, civilization had become a militaristic empire convinced of its right to dominate Asia and the Pacific. This transformation offers us crucial lessons about the dangers of unchecked militarism, the fragility of democratic institutions, and the way that national trauma can be exploited by those seeking power. Japan's journey from feudal isolation to imperial militarism wasn't the result of inevitable historical forces. It was the result of choices, each building upon the last, that ultimately led a nation down a path toward global conflict. Understanding these origins helps us recognize similar patterns when they emerge elsewhere. The promotion of military solutions over diplomatic ones, the elevation of national greatness above individual rights, and the use of patriotic ideology to justify aggressive foreign policies. The story of Japan's militarism before WWII isn't just a chapter in Japanese history, it's a cautionary tale for all nations about the dangers of allowing military thinking to override civilian governance, and about how quickly a democratic society can be transformed when its institutions grow weak and its people grow desperate. In the end, Japan's descent into militarism serves as a reminder that the price of freedom is eternal vigilance, not just against external enemies, but against the internal forces that would trade liberty for security, diplomacy for force, and democracy for dictatorship. The phoenix that rose from Japan's isolation transformed into a dragon of war. Understanding how and why this happened isn't just about studying the past. It's about ensuring that the lessons of history are never forgotten, and that the flames of militarism are never allowed to consume the peace and prosperity that democracy makes possible.